Mr. Jeff Shevlin.
Thank you, Ray. Yeah, Ray was very gracious to pick me up at the airport today and bring me here, so I really appreciate that, because my wife and I flew in a little bit early so we could be here today. But as Ray said, my name is Jeff Shevlin. I've been very active in the hobby for many, many years, since the early 1980s. No, excuse me, since the early 1980s. But I was a collector younger, but then I just became a much more aggressive collector at that time. And I go to about the 10 to 20 largest coin shows in the country, buying and selling so-called dollars. I've been doing that since the latter 1980s. And I've written a number of books, given dozens of presentations on it, articles and things like that. So my latest book is this book right here, So-Called Dollars, Volume 1 from United States Expositions, by me and by Bill Hyder. Bill Hyder often comes to this show with me, but he wasn't able to make it this time. He's my co-author. And we pride ourselves of doing research on these metals, finding pieces of information that have never been publicized before, never printed before, whatever, or tying things together to tell stories about them. So, is anybody here? Everybody here? Is there anybody here that collects so-called dollars? There's a few of you.
I have one.
That's okay. Yeah, you got to start with one. And then you can go from there. Yeah. Well, so-called dollars is a metal. It's a historical U.S. metal. There's many different categories of historical U.S. metals, or of U.S. metals. There's religious metals, military metals, awarded metals, good fors, advertising pieces, store cards. And if you kind of take all those things out, you're left with a group of metals that are just more commemorative in nature, metals that commemorate events in United States history. And those are called so-called dollars. Many of those were minted by the United States government, United States Mint, and many of them were privately issued. And there's a book that was published in '63 and reprinted in 2008 by Hibbler and Kaplan called So-Called Dollars. And that's pretty much a standard reference for people that collect that series today. But Bill Hyder and I are replacing that standard reference with our new reference. And we have a publishing strategy that we've been following for about 10 or 15 years with the things that we've been doing. We've written several books that were storybooks about these metals, basically telling the stories, why they're cool, the historical things that they are commemorating, the reasons why they're, in our opinion, fascinating to collect, because of the history, the stories that they tell about things that happened in United States history, whether it is related with the Revolutionary War, or some type of statehood centennial, or some type of presidential function or event, whatever the case may be. So we've written several storybooks on those, and they've been very well received in the numismatic community. And this is our first reference catalog. So if you put together all of the so-called dollars, there's probably about 700 or 800 of them. About half of them are associated with a fair or an exposition. So I assume most of you are probably familiar with fairs like the Columbian Exposition that's held in Chicago in 1893. There were 800,000 people that lived in Chicago in 1893, and 26.5 million people went to Chicago that year, 1/4 of the population of the United States. So you can imagine the type of economic impact that had for that year in Chicago. So most communities, and not most communities, but many communities lobbied the federal government to have the rights to host these types of expositions in their communities because they wanted to reap the benefits that it would, the revenue that it would generate during that period of time. So in the Hibbler and Kaplan book, the standard reference, they have about 25 different expositions that they have cataloged so-called dollars from. And in the research that Bill and I have done, there's actually about 60 to 70, closer to 70 expositions, United States expositions held in the United States that struck metals, so-called dollars, to commemorate those expositions or events happening at those expositions. This is a comprehensive book cataloging all those metals, and we're working on volume 2, which will be our final version. That should be out in probably another 3 or 4 years, and that will catalog all the other so-called dollars that are not related to a fair and exposition, like the Erie Canal completion medal in 1826 and things like that. So I'm going to sit down and kind of step through this, but before I do, does anybody have any questions? Well, this will be very interactive, so as I'm stepping through it, if you have any questions. So as I mentioned, this is a new standard reference. It's going to replace the H&K book with an SH numbering system. SH stands for Shevlin and Hyder. And you may or may not have already noticed it, but the major grading firms, all of them, NGC, PCGS, Annex, and ICG, have adopted SH numbers. And from our prior books, there's a number of, we haven't cataloged all of the so-called dollars, but we've cataloged different groupings of them. And those that we have cataloged in our books are now being referenced by the grading firms and also by the auction companies. So it's still being integrated in. And once this book is more out in the public, I just received this back from the printers last week. And this is you're the first ones to actually see it, other than my wife and Bill Hyder. So once, the next 6 months to a year, once this is more widely dispersed, then I'm sure they'll be much more integrated into the hobby today. So as I mentioned, catalogs, so-called dollars from almost 70 different expositions. Every exposition held in the United States from 1853, which was the New York Crystal Palace, through the 1964 New York World's Fair. And we end at 1964. There are other so-called dollars struck after that, and technically they're still being struck today. But that's all I really have an interest in collecting. And we ended at 64 because I went to the 1964 New York World's Fair in New York, and Bill Hyder went to the 1962 Seattle World's Fair here in Seattle. So we've included both of those expositions in our books. And this particular book is hardcover. It's 270 pages. It's full color, top quality paper and binding, and excellent photos throughout. And so that's the cover there. And I was hoping to bring about 30 or 40 with me to the show to sell them, but a box of 12 books weighs 40 pounds. So I just couldn't bring very many with me. So I just brought one of each. So I'm going to be taking orders. Anybody who's interested in the book, I'll go ahead and take your order, and I will ship them to you when I get back in my office next week. So where is that book? I was passing it around. Does anybody know? Yeah. It got passed around. Is there anybody who hasn't had a chance to take a look at it yet that'd like to take a look at it? There you go. And if there's anybody else that wants to take a look at it? Okay. So there's also a deluxe version. I printed 1,000 books. There's 900 with that right there, that cover. And then I did 100 deluxe edition books. And all the books that Bill and I have done, we've done a deluxe edition. And that's this here. It has a gold leather cover binding with a medal embedded in the cover. This is the official medal from the 1962 Seattle World's Fair that was struck by the United States Mint. And we only printed 100 of these, as I mentioned. And I also mentioned I just got these books back from the printers last week, maybe a little over that, maybe a week and a half ago. And I've already sold about 50 or 60 of the deluxe books. So I'm expecting they'll sell out, I don't know how soon, but fairly soon. So the regular book is $59.95. It's basically $60. The deluxe book is $149.95. So I've already kind of covered all that. I'm passing around for your review. And as I mentioned, this will become a standard reference book cataloging, because our other books are storybooks that told the stories about the numismatic events associated with these metals. But collectors, to generate more interest in a series, collectors need to understand why they're interesting. But they also need to understand, what does this series consist of? So this is being a catalog book. It's a comprehensive listing or cataloging of all the metals associated with each one of those expositions. So now if you have a particular interest in a particular exposition, like the 1905 Lewis and Clark, you can take a look at that chapter and see what are the metals that are struck at that exposition. Or the Columbian Exposition. The current book by Hibbler and Kaplan, they have about 110 different so-called dollars from the Columbian Exposition. Bill and I have about 200. So there's many, many more metals for every one of these expositions that have never been cataloged before, that we're cataloging for the first time. And in addition to the new varieties, there's also many new compositions that collectors didn't realize these metals were struck in. So they might think, oh, this metal is only known in silver, but it might also be known in white metal and bronze or gold-plated or whatever as well. So, and this was actually put together, as I mentioned, I've been collecting this series and going to shows, about 10 to 20 shows for about 30 to 40 years now. But there's a group of about a dozen advanced collectors of this series who all have been contributing information to help make this book as comprehensive as possible. So one of the things that Bill and I realized when we were working on this book is there's a desperate need for a new numbering system for so-called dollars. The current numbering system is broken and not expandable. So the current numbering system has like about 7 different categories of metals. They might have a local significance, nationally significant, monetary relevant. So they have about 6 or 7 different categories, and each one of the so-called dollars in each one of those categories is in date sequence. But the entire book isn't in date sequence. So if you have a metal struck in 1917, you'd have to look in about 8 different places in the book to try to find it. So our book is just totally by date sequence. And there's no different categories. We don't care, particularly, there's really no need to do that. It just makes it more difficult. And the other problem with the current numbering system is if you find 5 new metals to a particular exposition and they've already got them numbered like, HK 117 to 123, where do you call them? Where do you fit them in? You can't just start squeezing numbers in between these other numbers. And everybody's kind of doing that today. The grading firms will say this is an A and a B and a C, or somebody else will say it's X, Y, Z. It's just kind of random. And there's not any consistency, and not really that consistent in the new numberings that people are developing, since everybody's just kind of doing it on their own. So what we've come up with is a numbering system that is comprehensive and that will never break down. So basically what for the expositions is each exposition or each group of expositions has a unique number, well, I'll get to that in just a minute. But, okay, here we go. The SH numbering system, just to explain it a little bit. Using the 1876 Centennial Exposition as an example, on the left there, that's the official medal from the Centennial Exposition that was struck by the United States Mint. And that is SH 2-1. And 2, all the medals from the Centennial Exposition are number 2. I think there's like about 75 medals, so it's going to be 2-1 through 2-75. And if later on we find another 5 or 10 medals, they just become 76, 77, 78. They always fit in category 2. So the Columbian Exposition has its own number. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition has its own number. Some expositions that were really small and only have 1 or 2 medals, we've combined some of those smaller expositions. So there might be a group of small expositions which has 1 number. But each exposition has its unique number and they're in sequence. SH stands for Shevlin and Hyder. And then the last component is the composition. Sometimes it's abbreviated as an S for silver or G for gold or just spelled out. We typically abbreviate it, but oftentimes the auction firms spell it out completely. And yeah, okay, we have 91 different medals from the Centennial Exposition. I think in the Hilber and Kaplan book they catalog about 40 or 50. So here's an example of one of the pages in my book. This is from the 1853 New York Crystal Palace. Each exposition, of about 70 of them, has an introductory page which has some information about the exposition. It tells some of the historical events that happened there that are all numismatic related. The official medal is always the first medal cataloged for each exposition. So if there's, like the Columbian Exposition, almost 200 medals, the first one is the official medal from the United States Mint. And in this case here, this medal is struck in copper, white metal, and gold plated. And you can see, okay, the mouse is active. So right in here is a little grid that identifies the different compositions this metal is struck in. Those are the SH numbers for it, different compositions. Then it has rarity numbers. The copper, for example, is an R8. The white metal's an R6, and the gold plate is an R8. And we use the fold rarity scale, where R8, and it's explained in the book, and it's a scale that is many different authors use for rarity information and grading firms as well. But the R8 means there's 5 to 10 known, the R6 is 21 to 75 known. And we also have the weights listed for each different composition and the sizes as well. And we've also, and then there's descriptions and detailed information on each so-called dollar. In most cases, if it's known, we identify who engraved it. And truthfully, we have identified the engravers for probably several hundred so-called dollars for which nobody knew who engraved them before. So we've done detailed studies and auction archives research to come up with that information. In the back of the book, we have a list of all the engravers. So you can look up a particular engraver like William Key and find out all the metals that he engraved and all the different mints. You could look up like Whitehead and Hogue and find out all the different so-called dollars they struck. And there's also a cross-reference table for the SH and the HK numbers in the back of the book as well.
How did you come up with the rarities on them? The same for bought and sold and distributed?
Right. In most cases, there are no known mintage numbers. In some cases there are, but in most cases there aren't. But what one of our contributing authors is John Raymond. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of him, but he studied every auction catalog ever issued for so-called dollars. And he's got how many of every single one were ever sold in an auction. And then we've also got the grading firms who have cataloged them, certified them for all the major grading firms, plus my experience of buying and selling them for 40 years. So it's a combination of all those things to come up with the rarity numbers. Now, if you take a look at the rarity numbers that were published in the original Hibbler and Kaplan book, those are not accurate at all. These numbers are accurate. They would say something is common and I've never even seen it. And then they'd say metals are rare and it's like I've seen hundreds of them. So their numbers, their rarity factors were not very accurate. But that was also published in 1963. So it was written by two individuals in the early 60s. They did it independently with really no other input from very many other collectors before the internet and all that other stuff. So truthfully, they did a very good job of what they came up with in 1960. But with all the resources available today, we can do a much better job of determining those things. Oh, so here's an example of a page from the Centennial Exposition, and the official medal is up there on the left. On this page, this is pretty much the layout of the book. There's 5 medals on each page with high-quality photos on one side and the titles of the medals, the descriptions, the different compositions, and all the other information on the other side. As I mentioned, the first medal and the second medal listed there are depicted there are U.S. Mint products. They're engraved by William Barber. The third and the fourth one with the Liberty Bell and Independence Hall, those are engraved by William H. Key. He was an assistant engraver to William Barber. And I picked this page because it has a couple of interesting things on it. The third one is an example of a pointed 6. There are pointed 6 and rounded 6 varieties for the dates. And SH2-3 is the pointed 6, and SH2-4 is the rounded 6. And if you were to study those dyes carefully, or those metals carefully, you'll see that they are actually totally different dyes. Nobody's really realized that until we published this book, which is part of what's kind of interesting from my perspective and the perspective of other collectors. If we've identified dozens and dozens and dozens of dye varieties that have never been documented before. So this is one that's a good example of two dyes that appear to be similar, but they're actually totally different. But the main differentiating signature we use on them is the pointed 6 versus the rounded 6. There's other things we could have used as well. And also, on the fourth one, 2-4, there's a 2-4.1 variety towards the bottom here, and you really can't see it on the screen because it's just not quite large enough. But that particular metal, the rounded 6, comes with is signed by Key, who is an engraver, as mentioned, in the United States Mint, with his name signed right here. But some varieties are found without his signature. So that's the .1 variety, which is the no key signature. So the metal is basically the exact same metal, just some are signed and some are not signed. So those are minor varieties. So major varieties, we have them as different types, but minor varieties are just a subtype of a major variety. And this is an example of that. So here's the official medal from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Does anybody know who engraved this medal in 1893? Charles Barber, that's a good guess, but no. It wasn't a Mint employee.
Morgan?
It was George Morgan. I engraved this medal. And I don't know if it was known before there's a little M Mint mark, Morgan's mark, like right here. On the Morgan dollar, on the reverse of the Morgan dollar, on the reef, the ribbon, there's a little micro M there from Morgan. Probably most people know that. And anyhow, that same mark, Morgan's mark, is right there. And I'd never seen anything published on that prior to about maybe 10 years ago, when I was actually cataloging a group of medals to include in the Red Book. And it probably was known before that, but anyhow, that's when I first discovered it. And so this is one of the dies engraved by George Morgan. So I assume most of you are familiar with the Mega Red Book, or the Red Book written by Whitman. And one of the varieties of that publication is called the Mega Red Book. Well, I'm a contributor to the Red Book and to the Mega Red Book. And the Mega Red Book, I think their 9th edition is coming out. It should be out. Normally it comes out in April, around now. And I had been trying to talk Ken Brissett, the editor, and Dennis Tucker, the publisher, for 20 years to put so-called dollars into the Red Book. And they almost did it once or twice, but they always kind of backed out at the last minute. But when they came up with the Mega Red Book about 9 years ago, they contacted me and said, Jeff, we'd like to go ahead and include so-called dollars in the Mega Red Book. And I said, great. How many pages can I have? And he said, as many as you want. So I've been including about 30 to 40 pages in each edition of the Mega Red Book with different so-called dollars that I've been throwing, cataloging into that publication. So it's a great reference for so-called dollars, and it has their values in it, like the Red Book has values, has photos of all the different metals and compositions. It's a subset. If you were to pull them all out of the Mega Red Books for the last 9 editions, it'd be a subset of what's published in our book, except some of it's 9 years old, so it's a little dated. So this is a more updated version of that information. Okay, this is also the same official medal from the Columbian Exposition, but this is struck on a large cent. And I'm going to go back for a moment. This medal from the Columbian Exposition. And here's part of what you'll learn by reading this book. Is when this medal was first struck in Chicago, it was struck on a metal called Oride, which is like a brassy metal. And after a few months, it tarnished and wasn't very attractive. So they instead replaced it with after about 6 weeks actually, with a gold-plated variety. And that's what 99% of the people see today, is that gold-plated variety. Now Hibbler and Kaplan called it brass. It's not brass, they're gold-plated. But the earlier versions are this Oride, which is more of a brassy type metal. But they were also struck in silver. They're silver-plated. And they were struck in white metal as well. And most of those compositions were not ever known before. And they were also struck on a large cent. Well, that's a good question. Well, it could be nickel. Generally speaking, white metal is a term we use when we don't really know for sure what it is. So silver is a white metal, but we call it silver because normally we know what it is, tin or aluminum. But a lot of metals back in that era were just struck with a combination of products that they had just melt them down and throw it together and like a pot metal. But normally not quite the low quality of what you would consider a typical pot metal. But a white metal is it's really a combination of different metals that gives it a nice silver-like look, but it's not silver.
Okay. It's not aluminum though.
And it's not aluminum, no. we would call aluminum aluminum.
Yeah.
And aluminum became popular as a metal back in the around the time of the Columbian Exposition, or a little bit before that, in the late 1800s. And do you know why? Well, it was very expensive to produce before the discovery of electricity. And once electricity was discovered, they could produce aluminum very inexpensively. So around the time of the 1860s, 1870s, when electricity was kind of getting introduced to the United States, it was very cool to have aluminum metals, because before that, aluminum was more expensive than gold. Now that'd be like if somebody could now only make gold for less than $1. Everybody want gold coins or gold medals because it's very cheap and it'd be very cool. So that's how aluminum was back in that era. That's why there's so many medals from like the 1894 Columbian Exposition, or the 1893 Columbian Exposition, the 1894 California Midwinter, on a lot of those earlier expositions. One of the books we wrote was Discover the World of Charbneau So-Called Dollars, and that book won the award as the best book of the year on metals and tokens, as did the book that's up there that's going to be in your auction that I published a number of years ago, won the award as the best book of the year on metals and tokens. And in the Charbneau book, we researched the story about this individual by the name of Jules Charbneau and told his life story. And it's a fascinating story. Hard to believe all the things that person did. But that's in that particular book. And this is one of the metals that he struck. This says 1D 10K solid gold. And he was actually, the IRS approached him because at that time they said he was striking coins. This is $1. You can't do that. That's illegal. So that's part of the reason why he has about 13 different varieties of these metals. He's dealing with things like that, changing them from a 1D solid gold to 10K 1D solid gold to solid gold 10K without the 1D, and a solid gold 22K and 10K 1D. So anyhow, with a date of 40 on the reverse. So these different metals were out in the collecting community, and nobody really understood why these different varieties existed. And I researched them and kind of figured out what happened and chronologically explained why they're issued in the sequence that they're issued until the stories about each one of them. And all these metals are cataloged in our current book. Here's just a little bit of information about the 1894 California Midwinter Exposition. There are 3 expositions held in San Francisco. The 1894 California Midwinter was the first. It was held in the Marina District. The second one, it was held in Golden Gate Park. And if you go to Golden Gate Park, where the Michael D. Young Museum is, that's kind of in this general area here. This quad area is still there. It's a sunken down area in the middle of a bunch of buildings that still exist. The Japanese tea garden is over in this area, and that's still there today. And one of the features they had there was the electric tower, which was a giant beam that was very bright, and you could shine it into parts of the city and would light up the city like as if it was daylight for that city block. And these are some of the attractions they had out there. Dante's Inferno. People had a fear of, if you don't lead a good life, you're going to pay for it later. So this is kind of things like that. The ball of gold to the right was supposed to represent all the gold that had been mined in California since the discovery of gold. The gum girls on the lower left were considered scandalous because they would actually walk around in the crowd not being escorted. And those outfits were called risque. This is the official medal from that exposition, and this is engraved by Barber. It's not listed anywhere as gold plate except in my reference books. It was the very first day of the exposition. The United States Mint sold gold-plated versions of that metal. The rest of them after that were sold in brass. Oh, I need that. Thank you. So here's another interesting metal that I just wanted to throw up here. Until Bill and I published an article that was in the Numismatist a few months ago on this particular medal. Most people believe that it was struck by Montreal Dickeson for the Centennial Exposition in 1876. We found that not to be true. It was actually struck in 1861 as part of a series of medals struck by Dickeson dealing with how to finance the Civil War. So that's a pretty cool medal. And these dies, Dickeson's dies that he had engraved, and the medals that he struck, these Continental Dollar medal, fell in the hands of a number of different numismatists over the years, including Thomas Elder. Has anybody heard of Thomas Elder? He was a famous numismatist from New York City in the early 1900s. And one of the things he did, besides selling hundreds of thousands of medals and coins in his various auctions, was he produced a series of medals that were cataloged by Tom Dollar in the 1980s, early 1980s. And so this is a medal by Dickeson. He actually is known as one of the first real numismatists, the very first considered encyclopedia of coin collecting was authored by him back in the 1860s. That book sells for several $1,000s today. Anyhow, those dies fell in the hands of Thomas Elder in the early 1900s, and he used those dies and restruck medals from them. Q. David Bowers acquired those dies in 1960, and he restruck white metal versions of them. And Bashlow acquired the dies after that, and he struck some goldine, bronze, and silver versions of those medals. And those dies were donated to the Smithsonian, but what they neglected to mention is that the hubs that were used to create those dies were still in private hands, and I purchased those hubs about 15 to 20 years ago. And I went to Daniel Carr's mint. Is anybody here familiar with Daniel Carr? Yes. So I went to his mint a few months ago and gave him those hubs, and he made new dies from those hubs, which are identical to these dies, and we restruck those medals. And nobody knows about it yet, even though I did it several months ago. I haven't had time to do any press releases on it because I've been working on my book. And anybody who's really familiar with me as a dealer of so-called dollars, about once or twice a month I send out fixed price lists on the metals that I purchase to sell to my customers, as well as giving talks and presentations all over the country and writing articles. Well, about a year and a half ago, I quit doing that because my book had been 80% done for 2 years. I hadn't touched it. I realized if I keep selling so-called dollars, if I keep going to shows, doing fixed price lists, giving talks, my book will never get done. So I quit doing that last year, and the book finally got done. And that's another reason why I haven't gotten around to publicizing these medals, but I did bring some of them with me, and I'll be selling them for the first time ever at the show today. But it's probably several weeks, maybe another month or two, before I'll have time to start marketing them. And I don't know if very many of you realize that, but I do strike a couple sets of medals every year. Anniversary medals for sale, and Continental Dollar restrikes for sale. Now, I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the Wilson Dollar medals I struck in 1920, but I acquired the original die that George Morgan engraved for the Wilson Dollar, which was struck as the first and only overseas mint in the United States, and that was the first thing he struck at that mint in 1920, and I acquired those dies, and in 2020, I used them to restrike medals. I had Daniel Carr restrike them for me. I sold those, and they're very popular. I sold over 1,000 of them. And the Wilson Dollar in gold, there was only supposedly 5 struck, but there are actually 6 known. So there are 6 gold Wilson Dollars struck in 1920. And in 2020, I struck gold Wilson Dollars, 1.6 ounces of gold, 50 grams, and I sold 22 of them. So there's more restrikes, considerably more restrikes today than there are of the originals. So here is a medal from the 1894 California Midwinter Exposition. That's the exposition grounds below on the left. And on the crag, upper ledge above it is a grizzly bear viewing the exposition grounds. That's kind of a neat medal from that exposition. And you notice it says aluminum, as we were just talking about a few minutes ago. It was a very popular composition to use for striking metals back in that time. And I mentioned there are 3 expositions held in California. The 1894 Midwinter at the Golden Gate Park, the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition was held in the Marina District in 1915. And in 1939 and 1940, the Golden Gate International Exposition was held on Treasure Island. And here's the Palace of Fine Arts. That's the only structure still there today, or from that exposition, because for these expositions, most of the medals, or most of the buildings were built of a temporary nature. They're just a staff and plaster type product that was meant to be torn down after the exposition was over. But you could not house expensive artifacts from all over the world in those structures because they would not be covered for insurance purposes. So all the expositions had to build a number of permanent structures that they could house the expensive art from Europe and all over the world to be in those, to showcase them at those expositions. And the Exploratorium in San Francisco was the Palace of Fine Arts, and that structure still stands today. Here's the official medal from the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. This is engraved by Aiken, Robert Aiken. The United States Mint struck 5 commemorative coins for this exposition, a 50-cent piece, a $1 gold piece, a $2.50 gold piece, and 2 $50 gold pieces, the round and octagonal. Those sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Those $50 gold pieces were also designed by Robert Aiken, as was this, the official so-called dollar from that exposition. And in Hibbler and Kaplan, they identify it as struck in silver, gilt, and bronze. And the only one that's correct is silver. It wasn't struck in bronze, and neither was it struck in gilt. It was gold-plated is what it was struck in. And this is the official envelope that it came in. And the reason why I know about this is actually there's a tie-in to this show. I don't know, anybody here know Michael Sanders? He's a dealer who's in this area. Well, he used to be from California. I've known Mike for many, 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 many years, 30 or 40 years. And one time when I was up at this show, at least 15 years ago, he said, Jeff, he handed me this flyer on left, and he said, have you ever seen this before? And I said, no, I haven't. So I was looking at it, and it's basically offering the commemorative coins from the PPIE for sale. He goes, well, look at this. So I looked at it, I said, oh my goodness. And it explains here that the Mint was selling 4 different bronze varieties, a bright bronze, an oxidized bronze, an antique bronze, and a statuary bronze, or gold-plated. And as a dealer and a collector, I knew that there were a lot of different bronze varieties made, but I couldn't figure it out. So I had never sold a bronze variety, and I had about 70 of these in my collection at that time. So when I got back from this show, Bill Hyder came over to my office, and we sat down and went through those medals, and they fell into these 4 different categories. And even today, even though we did publish this in a prior article and in a prior publication, most of the grading firms have not yet adopted it. So they're still incorrectly cataloging these metals. But that's the bright bronze, oxidized, antiques, and statuary. And here's another just cool medal, just to kind of talk about a couple different things. This is engraved by Lovett, George Hampton Lovett. There's 3 different Lovett, 3 or 4 different members of the Lovett family that engraved medals. George Hampton Lovett did the most. And this is one that's called the Lovett Battle Series for the Centennial Exposition. He engraved 8 different medals that commemorate battles that were struck by George Washington in the year 1776. Some of those battles Washington won, and some of those he did not. And there are many more battles than just those 8. But because I'm a so-called dollar collector and I collected these medals and I start researching, like this battle here, the Battle of Trenton on December 26th in New Jersey, You learn things that make you appreciate what has happened in our country so much more because of these metals. Things that otherwise would just kind of fade away, would never really be brought to the forefront. But when you purchase a medal like this and you hold it in your hand and you read about what it's commemorating, it makes them special. And that's why they're a popular, probably the most popular and fastest growing area in the collectibles today in numismatics. And this particular medal, it was struck in silver, but there's probably only one or two known in silver of each medal. Struck in bronze, there's only 2 or 3 of each known in bronze. I've read that supposedly 5 were struck in silver and 5 in bronze, so that's probably true, and 20 struck in white. So these are quite scarce. But they're very affordable. I mean, quite frankly, by very affordable, I mean this particular medal in this grade, like is maybe a 64, 65, you can buy these anywhere from $300 to $700. So you can have a top quality, very scarce metal. If this is a coin, if this is a Morgan dollar, which there was 15 of them known, it'd be tens of thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you can pick them up for $500. So here's the famous painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware. Here's another example of the 1905 Lewis and Clark conjoined bust from the 1905 Exposition. And if you look in the current reference book by Hibbler and Kaplan, they identify, I think, 4 different varieties of this. In our book, we catalog about a dozen. So there's a dozen different dyes, totally different, unique, different dyes. You strike these metals, but nobody's ever realized it before because nobody's really taken the time to study them very carefully. Some have a date, some don't have a date. Some say Lewis and Clark, some say Lewis ampersand Clark. So there's just lots of different differences. Some have a different building on the reverse. Here's a very popular medal from the Columbian Exposition. This is engraved by St. Gaudens, the obverse, and the reverse die by Barber. So there's a combination here. This is struck in metal, and there's 4 different varieties of this metal. The other 3 have never been cataloged before, but there's 4 different names in this little insert here that was inserted into this metal when it was struck. So they have a little recessed area here, and they put in this metal component here and strike these metals and embed that into it. So there's actually 4 different varieties of that. And this is also struck in a couple different compositions, most of which are unknown other than this variety in bronze.
Is that the large one?
No, this is not. This is 38 millimeters. There's an award medal, which is probably about 60 to 70 millimeters, which has the same design on it. And there was supposedly about 20,000 of those struck.
Is that the one that was awarded to the
Yes, those are all awarded, yes.
I have one of those.
Yeah, they're cool. They come in, you can get them in a little, like a white jeweled case. They're pretty interesting. And here's the official medal from the 1909 Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Exposition. This is a gold-plated variety, also unknown. This medal is, who engraved this medal? Any guesses? Was the United States Mint product.
Brenner?
No. This would be before Brenner, I believe. 1909. Is that what he started? Okay. No, that's true. This is engraved by Morgan. This is another Morgan die. And what's interesting is I acquired this reverse die, and as I mentioned, this particular book has the official medal from the 1962 Seattle World's Fair in it. My prior official or deluxe edition, I used that die, gave it to Daniel Carr. I made another die commemorating the release of my book, and that's what's embedded in the cover, the deluxe edition of my previous book. And I do have, those were all sold out years ago, but when I was going through my pile of books about a month ago, I found a couple boxes of them that had been missed. When I moved a couple years ago, and they got stuck in a wrong place. So I actually have about 10 of those books. They were sold out, but I have actually about 10 of them. I did bring one of them to show. If anybody's interested in it, I can sell you that book as well. And that does it. Any questions? No, I don't include Baker numbers on them. I mean, there's so many ways for particularly Washington metals. I mean, now with Lasante's book and Baker's book. And then Hibler and Kaplan have numbers on them. You know, so the only cross-reference I have for any of the Washington metals is just Hibler and Kaplan's. Now, the grading firms, if you were to send one into a grading firm and you ask them to, they'll put the Mosante number on it, they'll put the Baker number on it, they'll put the SH number on it, they can't, and the HK number. They can't fit that many on it, but they'll put 2 or 3 on it, you know.
When did they start assigning?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. Morgan dollar is 38 millimeters, and so-called dollars have to be between 33 and 45 millimeters. So anything less than 33, like 32, and there's lots of metals that are 32, those are considered so-called half dollars. And anything over 45 would be too large to catalog as a so-called dollar. And they're not religious metals, they're not award metals, they're not athletic metals, they're just commemorative in nature. Yes, all the photos are actual size. So if you know, some are 33, they'll be smaller, 45 will be larger, so they're all actual size. And they're all actual photos. In other words, I mentioned that in my book. When you take the time to read it, you'll mention there's a little blurb, because there is a website today on Centennial Metals, the United States Centennial Exposition, that has fabricated photographs of pieces that never did exist and do not exist. So that person, for whatever reason, has taken different metals, the top half of one and the bottom half of another, and put them out there and said, this is a metal, and they're fake. They never happened, they never existed, they never will, and it's going to be confusing collectors for many, many years to come, I'm sure. But I do expose that in my book, but that's basically all I say about it, is that there is a website out there that has misinformation. And the reason why, the way I discovered it was, there's a Declaration of Independence medal, which is the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and it's based off of a painting. And there's about 5 different so-called dollars, and some by Lovett and some by Demarest, of that painting that are on these medals. And I found that website, and there's a 6th one. And I thought, in all the research, I've never seen this. How could it exist? And the more I studied it, the more I realized the first half was part of one design. The bottom half was part of a different design by 2 different engravers. And I spent, I kid you not, at least 3 days just trying to research this. It was driving me crazy. So I sent an email to Bill Hyder, my co-author. I said, Bill, I don't think this metal could exist, but here it is. I don't get it. About 20 minutes later, he replied and said, it's photoshopped. I said, oh yes, it is. It's obvious now. Now you see it. I can tell it's photoshopped. It's obvious. So I don't know why that person did it. But then after that, I realized there's about a half a dozen photoshopped medals on his website of things that he thinks existed. Or I don't know what he's thinking, but I assume he thinks they existed, but they never did, and they don't exist.